Thank you, Tracy. It's a real honor to address this group, to be invited. Before I start, though, I have to say what lawyers say. What I'm about to say are my opinions alone. I have worked with many great clients in this room, and you don't need to fall under the bus I'm about to put on myself. So, some of the best and most capable water experts in the country are in this room. What we've had the last couple of days is an embarrassment of riches. And that includes the water users and the owners of water rights themselves. They know more about their rights and the consequences of their water use more than anyone. Now, the laws of evidence won't generally allow us lawyers to call them experts, but we know better. Clients are masters of their facts, and I want to acknowledge how hard the owners of water rights in this state have studied some of our most pressing issues. So, speaking of issues, let me get right to fear. Okay, the title of the talk is Fear and Loathing in Kansas Water Laws, a great book by Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. That's about the only thing it has in common with this talk. There's no mescaline, there's no stolen Cadillacs, nothing else like that. Well, we know what we fear. We've had 2 days to talk about what we fear. Groundwater depletion, reduced stream flows, stream bank erosion, the loss of reservoir storage, water contamination, especially the contamination of public water supplies from industrial and agricultural pollution. We're afraid of, and justifiably so, algal blooms on our reservoirs. Now, why do we fear these? Well, that's a dumb question because they're scary. But we can break these fears into 2 basic categories. First, some things we fear because we know them pretty well. We can measure or estimate them quite accurately. We can measure the rates of groundwater depletion. We can measure the declines in stream and river flows. We can model groundwater-based flow and the dynamics of the groundwater system. Most menacing, indeed the existential threat of our time, is global warming and global climate change. Water managers have been on the forefront of climate change for decades because they've had to. The best example for climate change and water management is coming out of high mountain reservoirs in California, in the Sierra Nevada, and in the Rockies of Colorado. These are reservoirs designed to capture runoff from snowmelt. But as the snow falls later and thaws earlier, this is wreaking havoc with the dynamics of water supply across the West. Farther east in the Missouri River Basin, growing seasons have been extended. Planting can occur earlier, harvest can occur later, cropping can be more intensive, and that's adding stress on our water supplies. These are things we can measure, things we know are out there. Other things, though, we're afraid of because they're more difficult to know, or they're unknown until we try to address them, until we try to confront them. One of the big questions in Kansas water law has been, how much of a reduction in groundwater pumping will we need to meaningfully extend the supply of our non-renewable aquifers? How much will we have to reduce to restore and stabilize our streams and our surface water bodies? The canaries in our water mine. Well, how much of a reduction can irrigators live with? Dr. Golden and many other agricultural economists across the Midwest have studied this. How much dredging are we going to have to conduct? How many new reservoirs are we going to have to build to compensate for what rivers were designed by God and nature and physics and riparian geomorphology to do, which is carry the mountains to the sea. That's what rivers do. How bad is the contamination from toxic chemicals? From fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. Is it bad enough to destroy the usable water supplies of our most vulnerable rural communities? Who's to blame for this contamination? This is something lawyers always get interested in, right? A small group of evil doers, an evil group of polluters? In some cases, yes, probably. But we often don't know who they are. Many of them have gone out of business. And even if we could locate them, proving that this contamination is a result of this spill at this time can be factually quite daunting. Who else is to blame for this contamination? A large group of irrigators applying chemicals over a long period of time? Probably. But as a final uncertainty, we've relied upon the United States to build most of our reservoirs, our levees, our flood control works, many of our irrigation districts, and to help us reduce water usage through subsidies such as PREP. But what is the position of the United States? It's difficult to sue the United States. Even if you're able to, it's difficult to get an answer out of them. And what's the position from administration to administration? Or from Congress to Congress? These are things we don't know. So all of these fears of what we know, of what we don't know, fall into a difficult legal context. Because for the most part, what we fear most is the result of activity that has been completely legal. Almost all pumping in Kansas is done legally. It's done within the legal limits of the water rights that are out there. Most of the irrigators out there, very high percentage of them, are not breaking the law. In fact, the reason we know so much about our groundwater depletion problems is that our irrigators do such a good job of reporting their water usage. Similarly, their application of chemicals to their farm ground is within legal boundaries, within the permits of within the boundaries of their pesticide and herbicide and chemical permits. Many of these irrigators are trying to reduce their applications of chemicals to save money and to harvest greater yields of money rather than focusing on gross yields of crops. The greatest source of water pollution in the United States, irrigation runoff from agriculture, is generally legal because it receives an explicit statutory exception under the Clean Water Act. Indeed, to take this a step further, some of our hardest water quality problems are actually the result of conservation and environmental practices. By the time water in the Arkansas River flows across the state line into Kansas, that water has been used and reused about 12 times, roughly speaking. As a result, as it's been applied to ground and through return flows into the river, it's become loaded with naturally occurring heavy metals. As much as we would like to sue Colorado, or at least I would like to sue Colorado, for putting uranium and selenium and zinc into the water, that's just the result of Colorado shepherding its own water resources as much as it can. Similarly, some of the toughest nitrate and phosphorus problems come from feedlots. Feedlots that have been located in places that largely are the result of environmental legislation in the 1960s and 70s. Moving stockyards and processing plants out of cities and out of wetter watersheds. And so these things that we fear and the reasons why we fear them largely inform how we fear them. We fear them as individuals, as irrigators, as water users, as citizens. We fear them as members of a localized water group, as members of irrigation ditches on the Arkansas River, from the frontier to the farmer's ditch, or the Kansas-Bostwick Irrigation District on the Republican. Fear them as localized groundwater irrigators in the Sheridan 6 high priority area or other high priority zones within a GMD. We fear them as a regional group, GMDs as a whole, water assurance districts in the eastern part of the state. And we fear them as a state. That picture's still up there, that's unfortunate. These fears bring me to the second part of my talk, which is loathing. What do many Kansas water users say they loathe? Well, give them time. Let's just get the easy ones out of the way first. The government. The government and job-killing governmental regulations. There's the chief engineer in his big, shiny black helicopter, laughing wildly laughing in tears as he tears up certified water rights across the Ogallala. I'm here to tell you that is one nice helicopter. We also hate legislative and agency-imposed fees. Those are the easy ones. There's another thing we loathe, and that's the urban-rural divide in Kansas. This sometimes has the feeling of a loathsome relationship. On one hand, you have rural irrigators who use the lion's share of the state's water supplies. They resent how urban residents tend to ignore that water rights are property rights, and how high values for irrigated land and crop yields produce needed tax revenue for schools and infrastructure. Meanwhile, urban residents blame irrigators for depleting the Ogallala, for polluting streams and rivers, for harvesting federal subsidies, and, worst of all, ignoring their enlightened calls for reduced pumping and more environmental regulation. How dare they? There's also something like a loathing for Kansas water law. On one hand, most irrigators are groundwater irrigators in Kansas. This isn't Colorado or other states that rely mostly on surface systems. And groundwater irrigators tend not to like the crystal clarity of the prior appropriation doctrine. First in time, first in right. That's because in a groundwater neighborhood, the consequences of straight administration of water rights by priority are too draconian to consider. That makes sense. But on the other hand, most of the groundwater irrigators also claim to loathe the legal alternatives to the prior appropriation doctrine. The first, one of the more awkward acronyms in the country, is the IGUCA, the Intensive Groundwater Use Control Area, something that Mr. David Pope helped to pioneer in the 1970s. These have stabilized hydrological systems across the state, but not one IGUCA has been established across the non-renewable portion of the Ogallala Aquifer. As beautiful as the chief engineer's black helicopter is, it could neither fly nor land in western Kansas amid the reign of political opposition to an IGUCA. And that's a political reality. And it was one of the things that motivated the local enhanced management area statute, or LEMAs. We have two of those in northwestern Kansas, GMD4, but efforts elsewhere have stalled. In GMD3, perhaps the most powerful and the most important part of our groundwater state, there appears to be no interest in LEMAs whatsoever. And meanwhile, for all of this loathing, water supplies upon which irrigators' property rights depend continue to decline. Now, why do Kansas water users loathe these things? Again, let's just get the easy ones out of the way first. Let's talk about government. It's easy and convenient to blame government. And so it's also relatively easy, at least in the political context, to convince irrigators that a reduction in their groundwater pumping out of the Ogallala takings, an uncompensated regulation of a property right, and one that must be stopped because it goes too far. Indeed, I find it amazing how many Kansans claim to know nothing about the law. Or Kansas irrigators, they know more than they say, they always do. There's a lot of learning about Kansas water law. But then they can recite verbatim the last clause of the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Regarding the urban-rural divide, there's an obvious political and cultural divide in Kansas that roughly corresponds to this divide. The rural side of Kansas claims to prize property rights and crop and beef yields and a, quote, rural way of life. The urban side claims, and I emphasize claims, because they're eating a lot of beef, they claim to prize sustainability, water quality, and environmental health. And for some perverse reason, each side sees their respective prizes as always excluding those of the other. But why? How can you, why, in what world can you possibly loathe Kansas water law? That hurts. I take that personally. There are people in this room who've written substantial parts of that water law. Well, first let's get back to the prior appropriation doctrine. Irrigators claim that the clarity of first in time, first in right will lead to all sorts of hideous speculation and leveraged buyouts of farm and ranch land. What? Farmers and ranchers engaging in land speculation? The horror! Who knew that they did this? Okay? In other words, a lot of these people know what the law says. They just can't believe, in the wake of the Garretson decision, that it actually means what it says. Now, from my standpoint, it's hard to give that belief a lot of respect. To believe, on one hand, in the professional judgment of experienced farmers and ranchers and property rights owners, but at the same time, to sympathize with their unwillingness to recognize what they know all too well, that the most important attribute of their most important property right is the priority of that water. Why then the loathing for Igucas and Limas? The chief alternatives to the prior appropriation doctrine. Well, we've already talked about some of the problems with Igucas. Ken Cope has a very nice article in the Lifeline, the Kansas Rural Water Association Journal, summarizing Igucas and Limas that I'd recommend. Igucas have a procedural problem. There's a deep dislike, deep mistrust of how an Iguca proceeding actually proceeds, where the chief engineer has a lot of latitude in determining how corrective control provisions, water quality provisions, pumping reductions, and such like will obtain as a result of the proceedings. And as I said, Lima's addressed just this dislike and just this worry. But there remains a deep suspicion among many in Kansas and many irrigators that Limas are being forced upon them by the state. Whether in GMB 5 with the Quivira and Cheyenne Bottoms situations, in GMB 3. This again strikes me as smacking of a bad conspiracy theory. And this is why I think it's a bad conspiracy theory. I've had these people as clients. They are really smart people, but they're not smart enough to pull this up. Okay? It's not a credible conspiracy theory, because you can't claim that the government is incompetent and understands nothing on one hand, and at the same time believe that government is so masterfully competent, is so deviously brilliant, that it can pull that kind of conspiracy off. So, make me feel better? Thought so. Where does all this fear and loathing leave us? Well, let me turn to some ideas for how we might get past this fear and loathing, by emphasizing two things that I think about and have written about a lot. First thing is property, and the second thing is the public. The two most fundamental boundaries in Kansas water law have to do with these two related concepts, property and the public. In the Kansas Water Appropriation Act, some of you know this language by heart, all of the waters of the state are expressly dedicated to the citizens of the state of Kansas, subject to the private rights granted by the chief engineer according to the doctrine of prior appropriation. Our other really big water act is the Groundwater Management District Act. And in the legislative declaration of that act, it's written that the act exists to confer local control over groundwater use and management, but in accordance with statewide Kansas water law, namely the Kansas Water Appropriation Act. So, you have tensions in both acts: private property, public rights, local control, statewide enforcement. This can be hard language to parse. Sounds like you might need a good lawyer. I like Dave Tracer, one of the best of them. John Peck and I, Lee Rolfs and I, we're doing our best at Washburn and KU to train more of them. I'd be happy to hand out cards from other lawyers if you need. This is not a solicitation. I'm not being compensated for this talk. But, sadly, but we're clearly struggling with boundaries. We're struggling with boundaries between private ownership of water rights and the public's ownership of the state's waters. A water right is a right to use water. It is not a right to the physical corpus of the water itself. We're struggling with boundaries between the desire for local control of groundwater management and the state's authority over water rights. We don't know the precise location of these boundaries. They probably vary from situation to situation, case to case, the hydrological connection between rights, between surface rights and groundwater rights. These boundaries are necessary, but they've, in many cases, become impermeable boundaries. They've become obstacles. They've even become nuisances to addressing and confronting both our fears and our loathing. So I would propose that because these are dynamic and variable boundaries, and we may never know or even want to know their exact location, what we really need to do is build better connections. Better connections within local boundaries, better connections across the state, and perhaps most importantly, better connections again across the boundaries of our present time. So let's take these in turn. Regarding local boundaries, because GMDs are focused on the local control of groundwater management decisions, and it stands to reason that we must integrate that local, district-wide public into the operation of groundwater management districts. The citizens of Western Kansas who live within the boundaries of a GMD should have a right to determine their destiny regarding water usage and contamination, just as much as the irrigators who own water rights there. Why do I think that? Has Greg's gone off the crazy train? Radical judicial activism? No, I read the statute. It says right there, it refers to all water users, not just water rights owners. So whether you are in Meade, or Moscow, or Brewster, in northwest Kansas, just west of Colby. All of the water users within a GMD, in my opinion, based on how I see the statute, should be entitled to their share of local control. If their domestic and municipal wells are failing or being contaminated, then they should not be disenfranchised from their own water neighborhood. Unless we enfranchise those users, we're not really recognizing local control. Rather, we're recognizing and legitimizing the feudalization of rural Kansas by giving some people political rights over a public resource simply because they own land and water rights, and excluding other local people from those political rights because they don't. And that, my friends, is expressly forbidden by the Constitution. Next, regarding the wider public, regarding the statewide public. Our statewide public needs to show more commitment to the conservation of our water resources and the restoration and the expansion of our water infrastructure. Where the public, through our good friends in the legislature, won't fund the state water plan, then we cannot, with any sense of fairness, rely upon private water rights owners to take up conservation as a matter of private virtue. That is asking too much of the irrigators in Kansas. Likewise, where eastern Kansans, who make up the bulk of our population, won't commit money and won't commit political capital and real leadership to conserve our water resources statewide, to help maintain and restore our diminished stream flows, then they should be held accountable for that failure. All water users, whether irrigators or cities or industry, are going to have to pay for their water security. Our aquifers and our river systems are not, sadly, an open bar. Finally, I'm a recovering historian. I used to teach history. I also used to be that most insidious, disgusting, repellent creature, a state employee who is also a lawyer. Let me talk about the boundaries of time. We need to think beyond irrigation seasons, beyond election cycles, beyond commodity price swings, and reflect upon what property rights and the use of water mean over the long term. We need to overcome the confining boundary of thinking only in the present. This is a conference about the future of water in Kansas, and I'm so impressed by its genesis and how it's become such an active and dynamic and important event. Across the Ogallala, it has become clear that the most important attribute of a water right is not its seniority in the prior appropriation pecking order, but its viability as a reliable water right in the future. The future of these water rights hydrologically is becoming more important than their nominal priority when they were first granted by the state. So please, bear with me, consider the following hypothetical. Imagine a neighborhood of water rights with an uncertain future at present pumping levels. As the great water lawyer John Lennon once sang, it isn't hard to do. Without any reductions, assume that these rights have 20 years of practical utility at 400 to 500 gallons per minute to irrigate corn. Next, consider an action that reduces present pumping levels by 25%. Whether by an administration of water rights, whether by an IGUCA or a LEMA, or ideally through an adjudication of water rights. Consider next that, based on the hydrological calculations, it is shown that such a reduction of present pumping by saving groundwater extends the practical utility of these rights by 20 years. And consider also that the groundwater beneath these rights does not migrate very far. It is not a mysterious and fugacious resource flowing across the Ogallala like a whale. It tends to stay in place. That is, the groundwater is going to be there generally for private use by that property right in the future. The $100 billion question, is that a takings? Without any consideration of time, perhaps it is. If you were to have a river flowing undiminished, and you had a water right to 100 units of water, and the state comes in and takes half of that forever, water that would always be there, water that would always flow, then you'd have a pretty strong takings argument. But if we're dealing with non-renewable resources, and if we're considering property rights over the long term, which is what any sensible court would do, the 25% reduction in pumping doubles the lifespan of the water right. Now, I would submit with confidence that that is not a taking. Further, I would offer this, that under these hypothetical facts, doing nothing, failing to impose such a reduction, would, from a purely quantitative standpoint, take more property from the owner of those rights than the 25% reduction would. So here's the question. Is the state, through the Secretary of Agriculture, through the Chief Engineer, through the GMDs, are they collectively depriving owners of their private property rights by failing to impose the very reductions that would enhance those rights and make them endure longer? If we think over the long term, the answer to this question should be clear. I'll close with two thoughts. First, one of the smartest things I've ever read about water law comes from William Kohler. He knew nothing about water rights. He trained gun dogs. He wrote that, quote, "Every dog has the right to the consequences of its actions." He built his dog training system on that imperative. We would be wise to heed those words. Owners of property rights in water own many things. To divert water from a particular point of diversion, to place that water over a particular place of use, to divert at a particular rate, a particular annual volume, for a particular type of use, and most importantly, with a particular priority. But these owners also own the consequences of how they use that water, and they know this. And some of the most compelling leadership we are seeing across Kansas is from owners of private property rights who are stewarding the consequences of their own actions. Second thing is a quote from Edmund Burke, no relation sadly, the greatest conservative political figure of all time. He wrote back in the 18th century that society is a compact between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. If our commitments to private property and to the public are to endure, we have to honor that compact. The decline of the Ogallala Aquifer, of our precious streams and rivers, and of our storage capacity in reservoirs is a crisis in property rights. But it is also a public crisis, the permanent loss of waters dedicated to the public, and a crisis concerning the public itself. The drought has gone underground, and neither rain nor technology can end it. On the other side of the groundwater revolution, there is no cycle, historical, hydrological, or otherwise, to reverse. If our water-dependent and water-short communities, all of them, are to survive across the Great Plains, they will have to accept that aridity requires a public that is committed to its water supply. To sustain that public, the state of Kansas, and indeed all of the West, require more modest expectations than what we have so recently enjoyed, and requires greater cooperation across boundaries, and especially across generations. That may be more than we are willing to sacrifice. In that case, if we surrender the idea of a durable water public across the state and decide through inaction and cowardice that it no longer deserves protection, then our water crises will take care of themselves. And that will not be a libertarian dream. That will be a dystopian nightmare. I hope and I trust that you will not allow that to happen. Thank you.